All right, ready for a deep dive into a story that's both fascinating and a little, well, unnerving.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Today we're tackling Typhoid Mary.
Ah, a name that's practically synonymous with disease and danger.
Right. You've probably heard of her, but trust me, there's more to this story than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. It's a case that even now shows just how complex public health can be, especially back then when our understanding of disease was so different.
Exactly. Picture the late 1800s, early 1900s. Typhoid fever, it was a serious threat, especially in crowded cities.
Cities like New York, where our story takes place.
And today we're using excerpts from Mary Mallon's own Wikipedia entry to try and untangle this historical puzzle.
Good luck with that. It's a dense one. Even today, knowing what we do about how diseases spread, her story still sparks debate.
No kidding. So let's rewind to the beginning. It's the 1880s. Mary Mallon, an Irish immigrant, arrives in the U.S. and starts working as a cook for wealthy families.
Seems straightforward enough, right?
On the surface, sure, but here's where it gets really interesting.
Uh,
A pattern starts to emerge. Wherever Mary works, typhoid fever follows. People in these households, people she's cooking for, they start getting sick. Some even die. But Mary, she's the picture of health.
Hold on, so she was completely fine this whole time. No sniffles, no fever, nothing.
Not a single symptom. And this is where it gets really important to think about the medical understanding of the time. They knew typhoid spread through contaminated food and water, but this idea of an asymptomatic carrier, someone who could spread a disease without being sick themselves, that was revolutionary. Wow, that's like finding out you can set off an alarm without even knowing it. So how do they even begin to untangle this medical mystery?
That's where our detective of the day comes in, George Soper. He was a sanitary engineer, basically a disease detective.
Cue the Sherlock Holmes music.
Yeah.
What did this Soper do differently?
Soper was meticulous. He tracked Mary's employment history, every house, every family, and he started connecting the dots that everyone else had missed.
Wow.
And it was this meticulousness, this attention to detail, that led to his aha moment. He realized Mary was the common link in all these separate typhoid outbreaks.
It's amazing how one person, just by observing and some determination, can completely change our understanding of something. So Mary, without even realizing it, was carrying and spreading typhoid through her cooking. This must have completely changed how people thought about disease, right?
It's like realizing anyone around you, even if they seem perfectly fine, could be carrying something.
Exactly. And this discovery, as you can imagine, had a huge impact on how people saw public health and their own responsibility. But that's a story for another time. And that's where things take a turn. We're moving from a medical mystery to, well, it's a collision of science and fear and individual rights.
Okay, so we've got this huge discovery on our hands, a potential public health crisis. What happens next? Does Soper just waltz into Mary's kitchen and shut the whole thing down? Not exactly. You have to try and imagine being Mary in that moment. You feel fine, you're just trying to make a living, and suddenly this guy shows up accusing you of spreading a dangerous disease.
I can only imagine the shock, right?
It's a lot to process, especially back then. Germ theory, this idea that microscopic things could make you sick, it was still pretty new. People didn't really understand how their own bodies worked, let alone how someone could spread a disease without even knowing it.
Right.
So when Soper shows up asking for samples, demanding proof,
Yeah.
Mary's reaction, probably understandable.
So she refused.
Oh, she absolutely refused. Over and over again. She just couldn't accept that she, a perfectly healthy woman, was responsible for all this illness.
And, I mean, who could blame her for being a little skeptical, right? It's not like Sober could just pull out a microscope and show her the bacteria.
Exactly. This wasn't a case of malicious intent. It was a lack of understanding. Not just on Mary's part, but honestly on everyone's part.
So what did they do? How do you handle a public health threat when the person at the center of it doesn't even believe they're a threat?
Well, back then, they didn't have a lot of options, and their approach wasn't exactly subtle.
Uh-oh.
Mary was deemed a danger to society and quarantined on North Brother Island in 1907. It was that simple, that final.
Forcibly quarantined. That sounds extreme.
It does, doesn't it? But it speaks volumes about the fear surrounding contagious diseases at the time. No antibiotics, no vaccines. They were dealing with a very real threat, and this is how they acted.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do you balance protecting everyone else with protecting individual rights? Especially when that person might not even understand the danger they pose. It's something we still struggle with today.
Absolutely. And Mary's story, well, it becomes a flashpoint for that debate because on top of the quarantine, the media gets a hold of the story and things get a whole lot more complicated.
Okay, so Mary's confined to North Brother Island. labeled a public menace. It almost feels like the story should end there, right? A tragic but neat resolution to a public health crisis.
If only it were that simple. You see, while the authorities saw her quarantine as necessary, public opinion wasn't so clear-cut. The newspapers, hungry for a sensational story.
They didn't exactly hold back, did they?
Not at all. They latched onto Mary's case, and that's when the name Typhoid Mary really stuck.
And just like that, she's demonized, right?
Exactly. Typhoid Mary became this symbol of fear, the walking embodiment of contagion.
It's incredible how a name, especially one that's so negative, can completely overshadow a person's story. So how did Mary even navigate this? Forced isolation, vilified by the press. What happened next?
Well, she was actually released in 1910. Public sympathy, fueled by some growing skepticism towards the city's approach, played a part. But of course, her release came with a big condition.
There's always a catch. What was it this time?
Mary had to promise to give up cooking, her livelihood, just to assure everyone she wouldn't pose a risk.
And she agreed to that.
She did, maybe desperate for a normal life again. But imagine the pressure, the stigma.
Free, but not really free. What a heartbreaking situation.
Exactly. And remember, this is a time when women had very few options for work. Cooking, it was what she knew.
So did she try? Try to find something else.
She did, but it proved incredibly difficult. Faced with this fear, the prejudice, Mary eventually went back to what she knew. Back to cooking.
Oh no, this can't be good.
It's a tragic echo. In 1915, another typhoid outbreak hits, this time at Sloan Hospital in New York. And of course, they call in Soper.
I bet he already knew who to look for.
He did. All signs pointed back to Mary. She'd been working as a cook under a different name. The authorities, well, you can imagine the frustration, maybe even a bit of vindication.
So back to North Brother Island she goes.
This time, no second chances, no public outcry. Mary remained confined there for the next 20 years, until her death in 1938. A tragic end to a life caught between scientific discovery, social prejudice, and a public health system still trying to figure things out.
Wow, it's a lot to process, even now. This isn't just some story about a disease. It's about how we as a society react to the unknown, how fear shapes what we do, how individuals get caught in the middle of it all. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How would we handle a Typhoid Mary today? With all our medical advancements and how much we emphasize individual rights? It's a question with no easy answers, but one worth thinking about as we navigate this constantly changing world of public health and personal freedom.